Okay, so now we're going to look at some data and see how these different weighting schemes respond. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of various weighting schemes and kind of put together a little mini story. I have two particular data sets that I'd like to show here. The first is the Veil Nebula data set. Now this is the one that I've been using as my canonical data set for the past many months. As these things have been evolving in PixInsight, I basically just needed to put a stick in the ground and say, this is the data set I'm just going to examine, because we had to reprocess it over and over every time there was some new method that was published. And so I do think this is a good one. It really does give you some insight, because this data set doesn't actually capture all different kinds of data. It's fairly specific. This is undersampled stars of the Veil Nebula. So the stars are very, they're like pixel-like basically, and there are tons of them in this frame. There's also quite a bit of variability in terms of the transparency of the atmosphere and things like that. The extinction value is quite variable, and there's even differences of exposure time. All of these things together make this a very good data set. So it has half of the frames are 300-second exposures, the other half are 600-second exposures. I kept the cloudy data in here as well, because we want to see how all of this, how all of these weighting schemes respond to this kind of data and these kinds of values. The first thing I want to mention is that when you have two frames that look like this, now it's kind of hard to see, I think, on the screen, but if you look closely, you'll see the one on the left. This is an image that was taken high in the sky. Pretty much the best possible conditions that you can get. High in the sky, clear skies, everything as good as can be dark. On the right, it's the same. It's not the same night, but it's on another night. But the image was taken with the object being very low in the sky at high air mass. And you can see the effect of that. Clear skies and everything, but you can see that the image is not as bright. The contrast is lower. The background is brighter. All of those things, though if you looked at both of these images, say you were blinking through them, you would use both images in your integrated result. You would still use them both, I would argue, but you want to assess or assign a weight to the image on the right that is lesser than the image on the left based on some metric. And the metric that you choose, of course, is what these weighting schemes are all about. So here's an example of what it does look like when clouds pass in front of the object. You can see the stars get fuzzy, and they get even worse. The background gets crazy. So these, we would hope, a weighting scheme of some sort would just identify as having insignificant weight, low weight, or no weight would be given to frames that look like this. So that's how we would go about weighting, these particular frames. The plots that I'm about to show have this following structure, where I have organized them such that we have kind of 300-second exposures in one half and 600 seconds in the other. I chose a longer exposure, the 600 seconds, to be one of the reference frames. So therefore, when I put all of these different weighting schemes and plot them, they're all with respect to the same file and to the same relative measure from one another, because I've normalized them with respect to each other. I've scaled them. And then most importantly, along the bottom, this is why I explained about extinction, is that I've ordered the data with respect to air mass. And what that means is a low air mass being 1, and then going to higher air mass on the right for each of these two sets. Air mass does two things. When you increase air mass, you are basically turning a knob which turns down the brightness of the things you're looking at because of extinction. And it may also, in general, with increasing air mass, as you get lower to the horizon, the sky brightness will change. In most cases, I would argue it probably rises, either because of air glow or light pollution, but it changes. So increasing air mass just turns the knobs, if you will, on these different things, and that is what we get to see, how these weighting algorithms, or how these weighting schemes, how they respond to those smoothly changing variables. If I were not to organize the data in this sense, and we just looked at all these various methods, and we looked at it, but this would be impossible to interpret. So this is why it's so important to organize them in a way that really highlights some of these differences. So the first one I want to mention is a very historic one. CCD Stack, years and years ago, had its own rudimentary method of weighting images. The way that it worked is that you would draw a little box around some diffuse signal, some diffuse nebulous thing in the image, and you also draw a box around a sky-like values, and from that it would calculate a scaling factor. That is, that you have a reference frame, and then you maybe have your target frame. When it measured in the box the amount of light that was in the target frame, let's say it only had half the amount of light that was in the reference frame. When you did the normalization, you would need to multiply that image times 2, but you would remember that by having to multiply times 2, the scaling factor was a half compared to the reference frame. So when you add it in, when you integrate all these images together, it should only add in for half of the weight of what the reference frame is worth. 1 over that scaling factor, 1 over 2 is a half. So that's the very simple way, and you can see when you look at the response here of this weighting scheme that we can see the difference between 300-second exposures and 600-second exposures. There's an obvious almost 2-to-1 difference between the two. You can see that there is a slight bend with increasing air mass. That bend is with air mass you get, again, the light is becoming dimmer, and so this weighting algorithm the scaling factor is responding to that. You can see that in both the 300 and 600 second exposures. And you can see some of the fluctuation due to clouds. The clouds are the kind of the spiky things in the 600. Even though they were high in the sky, there were clouds that were passing through. Now, when we go to what was the new relative method, which is very similar to what I just described in CCD Stack, is normalized scale gradient. This is what became available in PixInsight first. And this method, instead of drawing boxes around a diffuse glow somewhere, it starts by, finding the stars in an image, measuring their fluxes, and then comparing again a reference frame to a target frame, and calculating a scaling factor by fitting the line of all the little ratios that you measure between all these same sources and these paired sources between the two frames. So you get a K value, and with NSG, like these other measures, we're also including a noise term. So 1 over that is what we would call our weighting scheme. And now you can see its response. One of the cool things that I found is that just the simple measure of just drawing a box on the screen and measuring these fluxes between two frames actually does a pretty good job. So as an estimate, the CCD Stack method, for many, many years, a couple of decades now, has been a fine measure of just at least assigning weights roughly to images. But NSG has this other level of sophistication, obviously, so that now we can measure in a photometrically precise way what this relationship is of scaling factors. And you can see now much more strongly the effect of, say, the atmosphere here, where it really does dive down in the weights get much lower with increase in air mass, and the same is true here, especially in the 600-second exposures. Notice the effect of clouds. You can see the cloudy frames go almost to zero weight because the light drops so much compared to what one of the reference frames was, where there were no clouds. Now, I described earlier that there was this measure that was the problematic measure, the dispersion method, the SNR estimate method. But if you look at this response compared to NSG, and I'm showing NSG here just because historically it was first. I'll get to PSF scale SNR in just a moment. But compared to NSG here, you can see it follows the trend of what a signal to noise, just a straight up signal-like measure, gives you. And this is because my data, this particular data set, the Veil Nebula data set, doesn't have big variations in brightness of background. And it also doesn't have a lot of variation in the stars because the stars are all undersampled, really. So we would expect it to follow, and that's exactly what it does. So it is a fine, fine way to do this weighting scheme for SNR purposes as long as you don't have these other issues, and that's the problem, you won't always know, or it won't be necessarily easy to tell. You have to be aware or conscious of the fact that it's possible for the SNR estimate to not give you optimal results. There is, as I described, the method which is the SNR-PSF. This is the one where you're actually adding the fluxes of all the stars after you measure them. And so the purple here is showing you how this follows. And one of the things that I'd like you to pay attention to when you consider these methods are, how does it behave under certain conditions? You can see that it follows very closely, as we would expect, because again, there's not much going on with stars here. It follows very closely in the 600-second exposure domain. But what is interesting is in the 300-second exposure domain, it doesn't necessarily follow a strict SNR thing. And I think that this could be one of these ever-evolving aspects of these weighting schemes. So this is where I get into trouble, but this is what my data shows me. And again, I'm doing my very best to try to show how things behave, and I'm trying to measure everything the same way, and so on and so. This is what makes it risky. I hope you appreciate this. This plot right there, this is what gets me in trouble, but I'm doing the best I can. So I would argue that with this particular weighting scheme, you want to be careful. Maybe you just want to be careful that if you're feeding at 2 different exposure times, that it really is responding to those and weighting those as you might expect. Again, it could depend on the data, and my data is a particularly challenging data set. The PixInsight PSF signal weight measure, the one here in orange, is now, this is the multivariable one, where you can see not only do we have the flux term, but we also have the mean flux sum, and we have m star here, which is going to be this term that takes into account the background. Now, this data set, that is the Veil Nebula data set that I'm looking at here, the PSFs should be about the same. These are undersampled stars, right? So we're not expecting this term right here to have very much of an effect. The only thing that should drive anything would be the m star term, but I looked at, in the data there, still there's not like huge variations in the background. So what I expect to happen, this is my expectation, my intuition would be that PSF SW, signal weight, would follow an SNR-like measure because these other terms are not too critical. That would be the logic. Now, if you look at this plot, you're going to say, well, Adam, that doesn't really follow. It doesn't follow it very closely. This is where I want to demonstrate that the software PixInsight and its developers are working very hard under appreciating data that's just like this challenging data that I make available. Things change through time with the evolution of the code. So watch what happens with different changes in the internal mechanisms of how stars are identified and measured. Now you can see it follows more closely, and yet in the latest iteration, this is where we currently are. This does meet my expectation. PSF SW does actually follow an SNR-like trend with regards to the atmosphere, with regards to the difference in exposure time, because these terms here are just not driving very much in this data. There's other kinds of data, the other data set that I'm going to show you in a moment, where that's different. And so you do get very different results. This is the kind of logic that I think should be applied when looking at these kinds of weighting schemes. There are, of course, other programs out there, and I'm just going to mention that you can do the same kind of analysis with any other program. Some programs don't even have weighting schemes for their data. DSS, as far as I know, does not. I could be wrong. The APP is another popular program. It does, and so I just show you the plot of what it looks like, and you can interpret from the plot based on my analysis what it means to see that kind of response. And then finally, I just recently gave a talk at AIC, the Advanced Imaging Conference. I would encourage anyone that enjoys any of this kind of stuff to go to this conference. It is made available every couple of years now, every 2 years. It's on a 2-year cycle. And the very best astrophotographers in the world go to speak there. I gave a presentation about this very subject there in a little more detail. And the one element that I wanted to show is that, PixInsight now has, among its many methods of weighting images, it has one that is the NSG-like method, which is this relative photometric measure of signal to noise. So what does it look like when you show NSG and then you show PSF scale? We're expecting, because the methods are similar, that we get a similar kind of trend or answer. And so as of, 3 or 4 iterations ago, this is in the past, this is what I saw when I made the comparison between the two methods. They matched very, very closely. But it was discovered that the way in which stars were being detected in the using PixInsight methods, there was a bug, basically, an issue in the star detection. So it's part of this ever going on evolution and improvement of things in PixInsight. When they messed with the star detection method, then I got this. And I'm like, I like the first one. This was going to be my mic drop at the end of my presentation at AIC. I was like, look, you can just use the weights that are produced by PSF scale SNR, and you'll get something very similar to NSG. So for those that don't need to go that other level of this expanded universe of what NSG is doing, then you just want to kind of automate through WBPP, for example. PSF scale SNR through local normalization is the way to go. But then I got this. What do you do? So more iterations, more talking with developers, and so on and so forth. Here is where we are now. I'm happy with that. We do have a very close match, as we might expect, with a similar method using the same data set. So that's wonderful to see. And this kind of gives you the sense of how these different algorithms are going to respond in these different conditions. So I'm now going to show you a completely different data set and how it responds. It won't have undersampled stars, and it'll have different star quality in addition to differences of brightness of background and so on. So let's take a look at that. Here is Crab Nebula data, and this data is very different than the Veil Nebula data that I just showed, which had undersampled stars. These stars are oversampled, and they vary quite a bit from frame to frame. And that is going to allow us to see the different kinds of responses that these weighting schemes show, especially in particular is PSF signal weight, because it responds sensitively to the different star qualities from image to image. So I have lots of frames here, and it's these frames that I'm going to plot as far as the output of the weight for each of these schemes. And I've already chosen some particular frames that we'll examine within that set. You can see where those responses differ significantly, and then we'll look specifically at those frames to see what by eye we can tell as far as how that weighting scheme responded, and we'll basically get a better understanding of how they work. Here then is output from a subframe selector. So you can send that output to a CSV CVS file, a CSV file, comma-separated file, and that data then can be plotted, which is what I'm about to show. I'm going to begin by showing you PSF scale SNR. This is the strict SNR-like response. I am graphing this ordered by air mass. So these frames were taken across many different nights, but when displayed in this way by air mass, you can see difference from frame to frame, but you can see a general trend, kind of a downward trend as you get to increasing mass. There is a downward trend in weight, and that's exactly what we would expect. These were all taken relatively high in the sky. It's just remarkable that these algorithms are sensitive to the fact that extinction, even though it's a very small amount, shows up in plots like this. I think that that's really kind of cool. What we should do then is just first, let's compare this PSF scale SNR to another method that's exactly the same kind, and that's NSG. Let's just see if we get a similar kind of response. Now, they don't need to equal one another, but we would expect similar kind of trends between the calculations of each of these methods because they are basically doing the same kind of thing. Here then is what NSG looks like, and sure enough, they do. They follow each other relatively closely. They don't always have the same value, and they can differ by up to 15-20% or something like that. And that is due to differences in the kind of photometry that each of these two algorithms use, or the methods use to measure the stars and calculate scaling factors and things like that. But roughly, they do have an agreement, I think, that you would agree by looking at the screen. So I'm going to turn off NSG, and let me just do one more sanity check with you, which is to look at PSF SNR estimate. You see this data, this Crab Nebula data, it doesn't have any differences when it comes, or not very much, when it comes to the difference in brightness of the sky. There are no gradients in the images. There's nothing to kind of trip up the SNR estimate through this dispersion method. So I'm going to expect it to follow fairly closely to what PSF scale SNR looks like. Now, it won't be exact, certainly, because it really is a fundamentally different way of calculating the signal of an image. It's kind of a proxy for the signal. It's kind of cool that it works, though, which is why it was the old default. So here is what it looks like. And sure enough, you do follow the same kind of trends that we see with PSF scale SNR. So that's a good thing as well. That's just a sanity check. That's why you can use this as a kind of a diagnostic tool to be sure that everything makes sense. Finally, this is the part that hopefully you came here to see. We are now going to turn on PSF signal weight. And what we'll find is, of course, that there will be a non-following, because it's going to be sensitive to this other element of the image, not just the signal strength and the noise, but also now, in some sense, the quality of the stars. So we'll turn that on. And here is the result. You can see what would be of interest to us, and we can see that the best frames and the worst frames, both methods agree on. So the very best frames here, we have these spiky ones. I believe I chose this one over here to be the best frame and this one down here to be the worst. But you'll notice that sometimes we have PSF scale SNR, the SNR method. It says that the signal went down, so it gets lower weight. And yet, there's something about the frame that PSF signal weight looks at, specifically in this case, we know it's the stars because it's not the background for this data, looks at that and says, oh, we've got to bump up the weight based on this particular attribute of the data. And we can also look at the other case where they are reversed, where in some sense the image is brighter, but yet the star quality is not so good. And so it actually brings the weight down as far as PSF signal weight is concerned. Those are the frames that we want to look at. This is the kind of information that I think you'll find informative, right? You generally don't see this kind of analysis. This is the kind of stuff that I do at Atom Block Studios. I'm only doing it superficially here. I go into much more detail on my site, not only about this subject, but I do this kind of depth on all the subjects that I instruct on as far as my videos are concerned. So let's look then at what that actually looks like as far as these images are concerned. So here is my reference frame. Now the reference frame is a non-special frame. It just so happens I picked an average frame here. The best frame is considerably better, this one, than the frame I just happened to pick. It doesn't matter which frame you pick when you're doing these weighting methods. It's just a relative thing between one frame and another, so it doesn't matter what weight we give. It's the relative difference between the frames that ultimately matters. So here we are with our reference frame, which is kind of an average frame. Here's the worst frame. Now this frame is worst by an SNR measure. You can easily see that it is much less bright, and the stars are not really any better anyway. So that's why even PSF signal weight would agree that it's not a great frame, because not only is it not bright in terms of just total signal, but the stars aren't that special either. So now we're going to look at that first case. The first case is where PSF scale SNR says, the image brightness, it's reasonably good compared to the reference frame, and yet PSF signal weight says, no, this is not a great image. So that is this frame here. Sorry, that's this frame here. This frame is a dramatic example of this, where you can see the stars are slightly out of focus. Now, this frame I probably would not have normally have kept, right? I would have thrown that away anyway, just in looking at the data even just superficially. But I kept it here because I wanted to show the true meaning of what it means to look at an image from a signal to noise point of view. If you're using stars and you're measuring the flux of stars, if you have a large enough aperture where you really do account for the fullness of the profile of a star, it doesn't matter if the star gets fuzzy or not, if the star becomes out of focus or not. We're not looking at star quality. All we're looking at in these measures is how much light you detect within your aperture, the total flux. And that does not change if you've encompassed the entire profile of a star. So this is why PSF scale SNR is not going to weight this image much less. If you compare it to the reference frame, the total brightness between these two frames is almost equivalent. There's not a really big difference between the frames in terms of their brightness. And so these two methods are basically, this method is going to say these two frames are kind of close to one another in terms of the weight. Whereas you might have the other situation where we're going to have a quality that the image becomes fairly dim, and yet the star quality is very, very good. So let's look at that frame here. This frame is the one that's weighted very low, or I don't want to say very low, but lower by PSF scale SNR, but the signal weight gives it a greater, PSF signal weight gives it a greater weight. And you can see why. Look how tight the stars are in this image, but also look how noisy the signal is, at least in the faint stuff, because the signal just isn't as bright. So from an SNR measure, this would not be a great frame, but looking at a star quality measure, this is a fantastic frame. So what does that mean? What this means is you're going to be the one that ultimately chooses what your preference is for what image quality means. Is it strictly just signal to noise, or are there other attributes of the image that interest you? Let me give you the arguments kind of on both sides, just so you can choose. I'd like you to choose these methods not based on a coin flip, but instead based on some, intuition as to what kind of integrated image you're looking to get. So when I see an image like this one, this is the image that, PSF scale is going to say is a reasonable image in terms of its brightness, and it's very true. So let's say that it wasn't out of focus, but it just, like the difference between the reference frame and this frame, let's just say that the seeing made the image a little fuzzier. And let's say we were trying to observe something very dim. Perhaps consider just the jet of the Crab Nebula, something that we wanted to detect. So what's critically important here is not necessarily the resolution, it's not the sharpness of the image, it's just literally getting enough photons to be able to detect whatever that is at all. Faint nebulosity, this wispy stuff in images, what's more important in general than resolution is just getting enough average light there to begin with so that you're beating the noise, you're beating the sky, and you're able to see whatever it is that you're trying to detect in the first place. The argument from a signal to noise person would be, it doesn't matter how sharp the image is if you can't see whatever it is you're trying to detect in the first place. And they would argue, furthermore, that if you had a frame like this, which might have been a fuzzier frame, they would say, I'm still going to add it in, because and I'll still add it in at a reasonable weight according to an SNR measure, because at the end of the day, the stars, when you combine these images, if I have fewer images that maybe are somewhat fuzzy, I don't need to knock them down in terms of weight just because of the star quality. The rejection aspect, the rejection part of image quality is going to kind of do that job for me. The sharper stars, or that are in the majority of the frames, are going to, as far as rejection are concerned, are going to be the predominant ones that survive the rejection process, whereas pixels that show the fuzziness, those are going to be rejected away, and you're going to still end up with reasonable quality stars plus that added SNR. Now, if you were to instead give weight, remember this is the SNR person, give weight to this frame, if you had a majority of these kinds of frames, this frame might be It might be that this is done through a cloud, which is very likely what happened to thin cloud. So the signal to noise is not going to be great when you integrate a whole bunch of these, but the stars will be fantastic. So the point is that you're going to end up with, it could be possible when you use PSF signal weight, that you could end up with an image that has a lesser signal to noise result, a noisier image at the, so that comes at the expense of making sure that the star quality is great. Now, the person that likes this measure, you look at this image and you're going to say, well, but Adam, look at that image, that looks better. I agree. I can see more detail in that image than I could otherwise do. So when you look at this more grand theory of weighting images based on multiple things, not just the image brightness, then that metric of quality, like looking at the stars here, or looking at the shapes of stars, or whatever the metric might be, I can certainly understand how, given that mindset, you're going to give this a much higher weight than just a strictly signal to noise measure would. So that is the ultimate analysis. You're the one that's going to be deciding. Sometimes people, what they want me to do is they want me to take images that look like this, and they'll say, well, Adam, let's just integrate them. Integrate all the images of PSF, PSF-SW, and then integrate all the images that are the same data of PSF-SNR, and show me what the difference is. And I think that that's missing the point. The point isn't that there's going to be a difference. Of course there is, because we are choosing to assign a quality to different measures. There's going to be a difference as long as that difference is represented in the data. Now, it so happens that this data set that I have, I don't really have enough frames that are going to make a big difference between those two once I integrate everything together. But again, I think that isn't the point. The point is it's your preference as to what you choose to be the ultimate quality. And I've given you a sense of how to think about it in terms of whether you want to add a number of images with these qualities or the other quality to ultimately make your final integrated result. In PixInsight, you now have that ability to choose. That wasn't always the case. When there was just one method, you had no choice. It was just the method, and that method did have some problems in certain cases. So PixInsight, like it normally does, now gives you multiple ways to assign, in this case, a kind of quality to your images that will give you your best optimal result, the one that you prefer. And that's what makes it a powerful software. I hope that you've enjoyed this analysis of image weighting. Perhaps it's a subject that you haven't given a whole lot of thought to. And now I'm hoping that better than a coin flip, you really can choose between one method and another to integrate your images together. You'll see these options in WBPP through the automation of that script, or when you manually calibrate and post-process your data, you'll be able to choose appropriately which way you want it to go. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to do more videos like this. Please comment down below. Let me know what you think of videos like this. There is an awful lot of work to create a video that is like this. It is different than just putting up two images on a screen and saying, hey, look what new thing PixInsight did. This has a much deeper analysis, and it comes with a little bit of extra, you got to be a little brave to make a video like this. So I hope that that braveness, even if I don't get everything perfectly right, accounts for something. Thank you very much.